Shalom Akim, Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem, Yahushai, Ba'ashem, Rakakadash. Double honors to the apostles and elders of Great Millstone, teaching us truth, and salutations to the sincere Akim and Aquathim. Listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will is always an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I just doing some meditation, in regards to women and for brothers who don't have any women, this is just an exhortation to be able to keep your spirits alive and keep your spirits up, and not look at your situation from a negative standpoint just because you don't have one. So the title, I have in this lesson, would be, if you don't have a woman, it doesn't make you less of a man. If you don't have a woman, it doesn't make you less of a man. And when you look at the landscape of this society, people, think that, there's a lot more to, being a man rather than having a woman. Yes, a woman is a very wonderful thing, obviously, in order, and a very great asset, to your household, right? But, one of the things that, as young men, when we go through, understanding, our culture and who we are, one of the the very few things that we learn at first is that we can have, an Israelite man, can have multiple wives, right? And, that is something that is, yes, we can have multiple wives, but so, when you take a look at it back, when you first hear that, you might rush, to try and get into that and do that type of situation, where that situation, it may not be expedient, for you to do, depending on the type of situation that you're in, right? And on top of that, also learning, how to have a closer relationship with the Lord, and learning how to deal, cheerfully, especially when tribulation arises and so on and so forth, right? So you have more of a sound, mind, so I guess I just wanted to kind of bounce around with a couple of different ideas, and not want, brothers to think that you are less of a man just because you don't have one. Because, sometimes these demons, do creep in and make you think that you're probably less of a person just because you don't have one. You know what I'm saying? Right? Yes, like I said before, it is a wonderful thing, and great, and can be served as a great asset, right? But don't look at the situation that you're in as, without having one. Don't look at it as 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 you're losing. Don't look at it as a loss. Like, it's just about changing your perspective in how you see the situation, right? You can look at it as, you have a little bit more freedom to be able to kind of move around and, basically not care so much, about, her worries and so on and so forth, because at the end of the day, it's a responsibility, right? Um, Another thing is that, especially in this world, in this culture, we're so bamboozled to think that, that is really what all that completely that makes a man, right? So I wanted to just hit a couple precepts, and, Yahweh Bashem Yahushai Ratiza, that this lesson, be comforting and keep your spirits alive, right? Keep your spirit, keep some fuel for the fire, right? Not let yourself be weighed down, just because you don't have one. A lot of these, as Ezra described, these are a lot of these times, these are mortal thoughts that, yes, we're men and we like women, yes, but, what I'm saying? But, don't look at it, as a burden, but look at it as an opportunity, right? So the first precept, I wrote down a couple, but, I kind of just want to flow around, so the first precept I have, this is Luke chapter 12. Verse 15, and he said unto them, Yahushua speaking, take heed and beware of covetousness, for as man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. Right? So see situations of men that might have a woman or might have women, for example. Don't get into that type of spirit where you're comparing him and his situation and your situation, right? you know Perhaps they can be things that you probably just still have to learn, right, as well. Also take that into account, right? And also learning how to be more stable. So look at it as an opportunity, not having one, to be able to kind of like build up yourself a little bit more. And I want to get that later on with an account, right? And possession is another thing I wanted to this is another reason I wanted to read this. It's also because a woman is also considered a possession, right? Pursuant to, I believe that's Sirach, the 36th chapter, right? you know so these things they are our possession, right? Don't it's Yes, you're battling these different mortal thoughts. I understand, right? But try to work on changing your perspective too, right? You don't want to get into a situation and then it ends up destroying you. The scriptures say, why shouldest thou destroy thyself? Because you know you learn that, and I myself am guilty of it, thinking you can have more than one, and you're just not you realize how much of a I don't want to say a burden, but you realize how time consuming they can be. And then you hear discourse from elder brothers that have more experience, and like, my goodness, man, all right. You kind of want to like, all right, let me not get too zealous, right, and destroy myself in my situation, especially if you have a situation and you don't have like maybe your own space, or maybe you don't have, like, you're looking for a job or whatever, what I'm saying, like that type of thing. It doesn't mean that you're less of a person just because you don't have one, right? It's just putting things in perspective, and essentially also building your self-esteem. Think of it as an opportunity to do that too, because you might go through some ups and downs, as Paul describes, learning how to be a base and learning how to be abound, how to deal with those different situations, especially when you're abased, right? So you're not really freaking out when you are in a situation, in a low situation, when you're being chastised, and you realize, the Lord took me through this, the Lord took me through that. I'm like, all right, you feel a little bit more confident. You feel a little bit more like, okay, Thawada Yahweh Bashim Shai, giving you the courage and the mental fortitude to be able to withstand those situations, because those situations are uncomfortable. And we know, if you've ever, been in close proximity to women in a very intimate sense, they start losing their marbles, when a little bit of tribulation comes their way, right? It could even be something as simple as a spider crawling on the kitchen table. They already lost it. What I'm saying? Like, think about it as Job's wife. Think about that too. Shall receive, and then Job had to kind of like check her, when she saw Job in that estate, right? Yes, the point is, back to the main point of the lesson. You don't look at it as, don't be a covetous, and then B, look at it as an opportunity. So shift your perspective. Don't be over righteous, to destroy yourself and your situation, right? Okay, so the next one I wanted to get. Okay, let me go to Sirach. So the next point I kind of want to hit for this lesson is pretty much, I guess, is a little bit, well, you can say it's mostly self-examination too. So this is Sirach 37 verse 27, and it says, "My son, prove thy soul in thy life, and see what is evil for it, and don't give not that unto it. For all things, verse 28, for all things are not profitable for all men, neither hath every soul pleasure in everything. Be not unsatiable in any dainty thing, or too greedy upon meats, right? For excess meats bringeth sickness, and surfeiting will turn into choler, right? So, some things are not for everybody. And the reason I'm reading this also is like, this is kind of like a self-examination, as well, because when you're alone with the Lord, without them, you're kind of learning more about yourself. You're learning more about different vices. Maybe there were certain different vices you were like, man, I gotta work on this, man. I gotta, pay more attention to that. I have to, cut back on this. Okay, maybe I should try this to be a little bit more bold. I was avoiding this. Let me work more on this to can make myself a little bit more bold, which would encourage me to become a little bit more bolder. Right? You know what I'm saying? So those different situations, and then having a lot of these conversations, with your alone time. This is why I said but before, looking at it as an opportunity. If you look at it as an opportunity, asking yourself these different questions, man, I was struggling with this vice. Okay, let me learn to temper that. Let me learn to, cut that back. Let me learn to wean myself off of that. I have all these negative thoughts. Let me learn how to discipline those things. Because you're fighting against the flesh, right? So, and then when you conquer those things through the spirit and power of Yahweh B'Hashem Yahushai, right? When you conquer those things, then it kind of gives you, it makes you, when you start to tend to forget that you are alone in a sense, because the Lord, gave you the strength to be able to, get through this different, adversity, right? Because and a lot of this dialogue of what I'm referring to, a lot of this happens when you're by yourself. You're meditating on scriptures, and then you're looking at the ways of our forefathers, you're looking at the ways of Yahweh Shai, and you're like, yo, man, let me work on more of these different traits that our forefathers exemplified, right? You try to match, you look at and then when you look at yourself, you're like, man, okay, there's some shit I gotta work on. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's some terrible, you have some bad habits, you had some different vices. You're like, okay, I gotta kick this, I gotta get rid of that. You want to clean yourself up, and Yahweh Shai is your physician, right? Yahweh Shai said it himself, like, they that are whole don't need a physician, but they that are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance, to roughly paraphrase, right? So, and then trying, you see what's evil for your soul, right? So, okay, this is not good for me, let me cut back on that. Oh, this is good for me, this is a bit challenging, okay, let me do more of that. Whatever, granted it is lawful, right? But you start to, look at yourself and see, okay, this is not mine, this is not for me. And what might be evil for you might be, good for somebody else, right? This is why you have to be alone to kind of have these different conversations, to meditate, and then understand, like, okay, this is not good for me, this is good for me. Let me cut back on this. Let me do more of this, right? Let me put myself more in situations that's going to help me to become more bold, whatever that might be, right? These are things that I can't really answer, for you, because these are particularly things that, only you would know, right? I'm only just reading the precept as it is, and I'm kind of just using myself as an example, and then, you know, um, being able to give you, sort of guidance to be able to, like, okay, and these things, it could be, you know, like, for example, it could be food, right? It could be alcohol, it could be sex, and these types of things, right? So I'm just using these things as, examples, right? So You don't give your soul everything, right? What might be good for you may not be good for, another brother, right? So a lot of this conversation, this mental dialogue happens a lot more. It comes out a lot more when you're alone, right? That's why the alone time, this is why I'm saying looking at it as an opportunity, because the alone time is very um, beneficial, right? So, you know, and then maturing, you start to notice, okay, this is you start to understand why the Apostle Paul said, a lot of the things that he said to the Israelites in Corinth, right? I wish, as a matter of fact, let me get that. Um, excuse me. This is First Corinthians 7, verse 7, and it says, "For I would that all men were even as I myself, that every man have his proper gift of the Most High, one after his manner, and another after that." Right. So, it's this is the benefit of actually being by yourself, because and then Paul kind of expounds on it later on in the chapter, because you care more for the things of the Lord, right? And then you realize, when you're by yourself, also, you can use it as an opportunity, to learn how to you learn how to deal with tribulation, a lot more. I don't want to say easier. It just becomes a lot. Your attitude kind of changes when you deal with tribulation, so you're not like losing your marbles, losing your mind, right? Because the wisdom is, as the scriptures say, wisdom shall meet thee in every thought, right? So you're learning how to, okay, you're not tripping when certain bad things happen, because if women, like I said earlier, they start losing it when some little tribulation starts to come their way, right? A good example of that is all these different women you see, and a lot of them are losing their minds, after maybe losing their jobs or whatever it is. A lot of men are not showing up to clubs and stuff like that, like, all those different car videos that they're making, and when you go through these things alone, you start to essentially stand out, because a lot of these men don't actually, when you in the world, a lot of these men don't actually, are not stable when they go through a lot of these things, right? So, and then you extracting, wisdom from those different situations where you were abased. Okay, the Lord was trying to teach me this in this particular situation, right? You learn that you essentially were extracting, as it says in Hebrews, um, chastening seemeth to be joyous, but you gain essentially peaceable fruit of righteousness, to roughly paraphrase, right? You start to extract, different nuggets from different situations you could have learned, right? And then having that discourse also, with elders and with other godly men and so on and so forth, right? You get more and more understanding, and then it makes you more valuable, right? Because a lot of these men can have women, but they don't have the understanding to be able to properly guide them in different situations, right? Especially when it comes to spiritual, because the spiritual man judgeth all things, right? So um let me go to, just bear with me 1 second, my laptop's kind of freezing. Okay, this is Genesis chapter 29. Let's see where I want to start. I'll start at verse 15, and it says, And Laban said to Jacob, Because thou art my brother, that shouldest thou therefore serve me for naught? Tell me, what shall thy wages be? And Laban had two daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. And Leah was tender-eyed, but Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. And Jacob loved Rachel and said, I will serve thee 7 years for Rachel, thy younger daughter, right? And Laban said, It is better that I give her to thee than I should give her to another man. Abide with me. And Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, um, and they seemed unto him but a few days, for the love that he had to her. And Jacob said to Laban, Give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, and that I may go in unto her. Right. So, this was during the time, Jacob, Isaac, gives his charge to Jacob, don't go into, who was it? I forgot if I believe they were. I believe it was Canaanites. He said, "Don't go in onto." Right. So he sends, okay, go on to your mother's, side of the family, right? So and then meets with Laban, and I'll serve these 7 years, and then eventually when you go through the story, um, Jacob, he served 7 years, and then, you know, for Leah, and then he decided, okay, man, I want to serve another 7 years for Rachel, right? But that the point I kind of wanted to hit was the portion of 7 years, because before Jacob actually had these women, he had to serve a certain amount of time, and I essentially try to and establish and build himself, right? That's pretty much the point I kind of wanted to hit, through this. He had to serve, work, what I'm saying, and and take that time and actually properly build and establish himself, right? In a lot of these different cultures, well, a lot of those cultures are Jake, like in Western Africa, before a dude decides to marry, um, when he wants to get married, they have to do, like, what they would know as a dowry, right? And a lot of different tribes, they have to provide, the groom, has to provide some sort of payment, whether it be like a cow, or it might be money, or it might be clothing and stuff like that. So he had to, essentially, the point is, you know the man had to, like, establish himself. He had to work and establish himself, right. And it's the same. The principle is the same, with us, right. I'm not saying, we're gonna prosper, in this society, right, because we see that Babylon's not gonna be healed. But the point is, there's a process that Jacob went through in terms of building, right. And then he got the woman, right. So so this is an opportunity to build more and more spiritual, nuggets, and then go through and extrapolate different situations. And essentially, you can use the alone time as an opportunity to kind of tidy yourself, not for her, but she would all women, they will definitely benefit, because of your spiritual understanding, right. The scriptures say that a woman shall be, I'm sorry, let me get it, it's in Isaiah somewhere. I'm sorry, it's a man. Hold on. That's my fault. Hold on. Okay, Isaiah 32:2, and it says, And a man shall be as an hiding place from the wind, and a covert from the tempest, and a rivers of water in a dry place, and as the shadow of a great rock in a weary land, right? So a man, an elect man, will be a very, very precious man, because a lot of these men, that a lot of them are going to go to the war and fight and die, right? So there's going to be, as pursuant to Second Ezra, a lot of these women would be, the virgin shall mourn having no husbands, right? This is the way that the society is going, right? So and a man is going to be a hiding place from the wind, right? So it'll be essentially a covering, because a lot of these women are out here, and they don't have any covering, right? So um, that's pretty much it. I didn't want to make the lesson too long, but I kind of just wanted to, kind of keep brothers' spirits, up. Just because you don't have one doesn't make you less of a man, right? Even if you go into the story of Joseph, he gained favor from Pharaoh, and eventually then, he got, he decided, okay, I'm gonna, he met this woman, and then he married, and then he had his children. But the point really is that, he had favor. The Lord was with him even in his time of being alone. And then, he was able to break down the Pharaoh's dream, and then he gained favor, right? He gained favor from the Pharaoh, right? But, and then it's interesting that in that story also, the Lord, I'm sorry, it was the Pharaoh that, kind of gave him some jewelry and some fine linen, and linen is expensive, right? So, but it shows you the man, Joseph, he was decked out. Before he was decked out physically, he was decked out spiritually, right? That was most important, right? So, that's pretty much it, but no, Yahweh Ratazah, that this lesson was edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory and honor to Yahweh Bashim Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.